and welcome everyone. Hello everyone, thank you for joining us. This is our last webinar before the holiday Christmas. I'm already in the mood, I hope you are as well. With me today on the call is Alex Haynes. He will introduce himself shortly. But before that, I wanted, as usual, to start with land acknowledgement. Clean Air Partnership is a Toronto-based organization, and we acknowledge that the land on which we operate is the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. As part of our land acknowledgement, we try to make it so that we can learn something, that it's a story from Indigenous peoples about their stories and history and culture and tradition. So I'll share a short video. Give me a second.
Foremost as Anishinaabe Kwe, a Ojibwe woman. And then with that basic understanding, I ride bikes, I fix bikes, I sew, I paint. The thing about ultra races, it's just getting to the finish line. And I don't think there's any one way that I do it. It's having a tough brain. I have a lot of stuff to process mentally and emotionally. For a really long time, I felt like I have to pick that cycling culture to live within or my Indigenous culture to live within. But I realized I can't have one without the other. And together, they seem to be stronger.
Thanks for watching this. This is a part of a longer video film. It's a 30-minute film that the Free Hub magazine produced, and it's about Alexandra Hochin. If you have time, I'll share a link at some point in the chat. Very quickly, Clean Air Council tools, we are tracking climate-related policies in the Climate Policy Database, and we track implemented projects even beyond CAC as we feature some good practices and leading examples from municipalities across Canada. And we do this in our Climate Action Atlas. I will share a link to those tools in the chat so you can access them. And lastly, our first webinar for the new year, it's going to be on home energy rating and disclosure webinar. We developed a tool last year, or a guideline, I guess, and we're going to share more about this on January 17 and 1 p.m. Now, without further ado, I'm going to pass it to Alex.
Thank you, Desi. I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see this?
Yeah.
Okay. So hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Alex Haynes. I'm a Master's of Planning student at the School of Urban and Regional Planning at TMU. Last summer, I conducted research with TCAT on the barriers between policy and implementation for complete streets and Vision Zero infrastructure. And in this presentation, I'll be sharing my research and findings with all of you. So this gives you a rough idea of what I'll be talking about, starting with an overview of the project and its findings, followed by a discussion of the methods used. I will then be discussing the findings, beginning with a look at the state of complete streets and Vision Zero policy and implementation in Ontario. And then that'll be followed by discussion of the barriers to implementation discussed during interviews. I'll then wrap things up with my conclusion and take a moment to discuss my next research project, which will be launching off some of the findings from this project. And then I'll open the floor to Q&A. This research looked at two safe street movements in Ontario, those being Complete Streets, which is an approach to street design that aims to accommodate all users regardless of age, ability, and mode of travel, and Vision Zero, which is a global road safety movement that aims to reduce all traffic-related serious injuries and fatalities to zero. These two approaches have a great deal of overlap in their objectives and priorities. For example, they aim to create safer and more equitable streets for all. But they are different in a few key ways. For Complete Streets, safety is just one objective. Complete Streets also has an accessibility and streetscaping components. And Vision Zero is more singularly focused on road safety, but incorporates countermeasures that fall outside the purview of Complete Streets. For example, there's education, engagement, and enforcement countermeasures. These two approaches are also different in some nuanced ways that we will see, but both of them incorporate infrastructure improvements that aim to achieve mutual goals. And that infrastructure piece is the focus of this research. The purpose of the research is to understand why there appears to be seemingly rapid policy growth for both approaches, but slower implementation in Ontario. Ultimately, Safe Street advocates care about what gets built more so than what policy is adopted. So this leads to our research questions, which was firstly, was the stay of Complete Streets and Vision Zero policy in Ontario, and how effective has this policy been at putting shovels in the ground? And secondly, what is it that still gets in the way of building Complete Streets and Vision Zero infrastructure when municipalities have theoretically all of the right policy? So here's a brief overview of the findings. Answering the first question, it appears that abundant policy is associated with more implementation, although the effect appears to be small. It was difficult to assess how successful municipalities were in implementing projects, partly because of a lack of information on municipal websites. Complete Streets projects did not seem particularly abundant compared to non-Complete Streets projects. And so policy is helping implementation. It just appears that's not the whole picture. So over the course of barriers, over the course of interviews, I identified 6 barriers, those being policy, cultures of opposition, staff coordination, budgeting and resources, balancing needs, and data. So look at the method for the first question. It was answered mostly through a scan of policies and municipal websites. That included 46 municipalities in Ontario, and I coded documents and projects and analyzed them, descriptively analyzed them using graphs. The second research question was answered through the interviews with municipal planners and engineers from 7 municipalities, those being Guelph, Hamilton, London, Markham, Mississauga, Peel, and Toronto. Participants were asked 6 broad questions about Complete Streets and Vision Zero policies and projects, and 6 themes were identified. So we can start by looking at that first section, which is policy and implementation. In that scan, I looked at official plans, transportation master plans, and active transportation plans, and assessed them for presence of Complete Streets policies, which is to say, I looked for direction, policy direction, to use an approach that accommodates all users in street planning. I also recorded if municipalities had Complete Streets guidelines. Other commonalities were coded, however, that coding did not really come into play in the assessment here. Municipal websites were scanned for Complete Streets infrastructure projects, which did not necessarily mean those projects include like a Complete Streets rationale, but sometimes that happened. But I was more generally looking for implementation of infrastructure that improves safety or experience for vulnerable road users. In some instances, this included Vision Zero-like countermeasures or traffic calming. I limited this research to a maximum of 3 projects coded per municipality. And this was due to time constraints, also because 46 municipalities is a lot to scan. I also chose this maximum because I wasn't perceiving that a lot of municipalities were exceeding it, but I wouldn't expect the findings to change much if this limit was increased. It was also coded if municipalities had Vision Zero or road safety strategies, but I was specifically looking for Vision Zero And this was a nuanced problem because a lot of road safety strategies actually include significant elements of Vision Zero, such as the commitment to reach zero deaths and fatality, or deaths and serious injuries in traffic-related collisions. One example would be Guelph's community road safety strategy, which includes such commitments, has a lot of the ideas of a Vision Zero plan, but is not necessarily named as such. And then with that coding, I compared adoption of policy to implementations descriptively. So I've selected 3 graphs of the 7 that appear in the report, because I think these kind of display the narrative the best. So first we look at a comparison between the number of policies that incorporate complete streets versus the average number of complete street projects in a municipality. And this shows a roughly linear relationship, meaning that municipalities with more policies that use a complete streets approach tend to have more complete streets projects on their websites. So there's a cumulative effect, apparently a cumulative effect here. And then I looked at the individual policies to see the relationship those had with projects, number of projects, and we see also a positive relationship. I don't dwell on this much at all, I think, in the report, but I thought it was interesting that the presence of complete streets policies in official plans seems to account for the largest difference individually in this sample. And I suspect that maybe this is because it can compel changes as opposed to merely outlining best practice, but I'd be interested in if anyone had a theory here. Vision Zero, I thought this was really interesting. So this looked specifically at Vision Zero, and you can see that it actually has a larger change, accounts for a larger change than adoption of complete streets in official plans has. And my thought is maybe this is because Vision Zero is overall newer than complete streets in Ontario. So perhaps Vision Zero municipalities are just kind of leading the pack. They're the ones who care the most about these issues, I guess. But I also suspect maybe the message of Vision Zero might also particularly be resonant with folks. Theoretically, everyone is in favor of safer streets. So perhaps forefronting safety as a narrative makes implementation easier. So what's the takeaway? It appears that complete streets and Vision Zero policies are effective both individually and cumulatively. The effect does not appear to be particularly strong, which is admittedly partly because of the limit of 3 coded projects per municipality. But once again, I did choose that limit because I was not perceiving that many municipalities were exceeding the limit, and I wouldn't expect the findings to change significantly if I increased it to 4 or 5. But overall, I think what this shows is that other factors are at play besides just policy. I also want to highlight a few general observations. Complete streets and Vision Zero were not often referenced as part of the rationale for these projects, which seems like a missed opportunity in places to strengthen the rationale of those projects by connecting them explicitly to a city's pre-existing policy and guidelines. Most of the projects I coded as complete streets were often found under active transportation sections, meaning that the kind of recommendations that all street planning projects be complete street projects doesn't seem to be widely adopted or used in municipalities. There's also, I noticed that few municipalities had key performance indicators that would demonstrate growth in complete streets infrastructure, such as linear kilometers of bike facilities. They might give that metric to date, but not like a year-over-year growth that would really demonstrate how that network has been changing. So overall, also assessing success in municipalities was difficult, success in implementation. And it seems that there could be better communication on the progress that is being made to the public. So next we'll look at the barriers to implementation, which were found through the interviews. As a reminder, those barriers are policy, cultures of opposition, staff coordination, budgeting and resources, balancing needs, and data. So beginning with policy, despite the abundance of policy that I've mentioned already, many interviewees expressed their view that policy could better serve Complete Streets and Vision Zero planners. They indicated that high-level policy was not particularly helpful internally. An official plan, for example, might say that every street should be a complete street, but it's not clear what that means. So guidelines give operationalizing details, which make it more efficient to implement a complete street and clarify what a complete street even means. Practitioners also felt that current policies could be too ideal or lack pragmatism, in that they might really be more prescribing ideal road makeups for new road projects as opposed to retrofit projects. It was also stressed that the rationale present in policies and guidelines could be improved, especially for streetscaping elements, which can sometimes be seen as a nice to have and not a need to have. As you will see in the subsequent slides, policy is often the preferred solution proposed in interviews. So the cultural component was a big topic of conversation. Practitioners tended to agree that conversations about street planning can still be quite auto-oriented. There's a reluctance to remove space from for cars from the road, which a lot of practitioners noted. And that is the result of loud vocal opposition to projects perceived as anti-car. In particular, practitioners noted how support for Complete Streets and Vision Zero tends to be quite broad in the planning phase, but opposition becomes more pronounced during implementation. Theoretically, once again, no one is opposed to safer streets, but once shovels hit the ground, fears about loss of car space become more pronounced. There are other considerations mentioned too, such as impacts on private property. Interviewees noted opposition from many different stakeholders, including municipal staff, politicians, and the public. However, participants did not think this opposition represented the majority opinion, but rather a highly vocal minority. Solutions to these barriers include stronger rationales in policy, staff training, and more extensive public engagement. Practitioners also noted the importance of having support from council and particularly the mayor's office. Staff coordination was another big point of conversation. Practitioners noted how municipal staff are required to notify each other of relevant work, but sometimes fail to do so. Planners and engineers are busy people and they forget or postpone communicating about relevant projects until it's too late. It was thought that this could be due to the lack of clarity on when communication was needed in the first place. One idea mentioned as a solution was the introduction of a staff member or a committee that was responsible for overseeing and flagging projects for review. But here, we can also connect to an idea I forgot to mention earlier, the idea of disseminating details from guidelines into engineering specifications. And the reason that's important here is because it might mitigate some of the need for communication if engineers broadly are referencing the specifications from those guidelines in their day-to-day practice. Next, looking at budgeting and resources, practitioners did not seem to think funding for infrastructure was an issue per se, but that funding for other related projects was lacking. For example, there was a catch-22 with regarding the plowing of bike lanes. There aren't sometimes there might not be enough bike lanes to justify purchasing the plows, but without purchasing those plows, it's difficult to justify building the bike lanes as they won't be serviceable in the winter. Another practitioner mentioned how it wasn't once again, I said the infrastructure wasn't necessarily an issue did not have an issue of funding, but designing the road or doing a road redesign often was harder to achieve funding. And so it seems like it's the earlier stages of the process that might need more funding and attention. It was also once again discussed this reluctance to remove car space can balloon projects because it leads some complete streets planners to focus on complete streets additions as opposed to that subtractive element. So it's relatively less expensive to reallocate space, but because it can be politically contentious, planners might end up advocating for trying to widen the road, widen the right of way. A couple of solutions posed. One was itemized costing of complete streets elements, which would curtail issues of elements being either removed prior to implementation or retroactively. One example of this would be streetscaping and street trees, which were often undervalued and not well understood for the value that they provide, but also how much it would cost to maintain them. And this also connects to that need for stronger rationale in policy and guidelines. Next, planners and engineers spoke about balancing needs and unideal compromises. For complete streets planners, this was a tendency to lament the lack of space to add components to the road. This meant compromises between complete streets elements. For example, removing street trees to add a bike lane. A lot of complete streets compromises appear to be the result of that reluctance to remove space for cars. Interestingly, there was a conflict here that I noticed between complete streets and Vision Zero approaches, because the complete streets planner is thinking about what they can add, or that was my perception. They want to add more to the road, but a Vision Zero planner thinks about the road and sees how it's too wide, because narrower roads are generally safer. So it seems like some complete streets planners are wishing that the road was wider, whereas Vision Zero planners are wishing the road was narrower. And this is something I'm actually going to do a bit of research on. I'll talk about this later. The implementation of Vision Zero infrastructure can also raise equity issues, as in like who gets what kind of countermeasure, which can be dependent on context. This is often correlated with different demographics. For example, residents on arterial roads are less likely to benefit from engineered countermeasures than those who live on local streets. Once again, planners appealed to the need for rationale and guidelines. There was especially the need to justify road diets or car space subtractions. Planners also mentioned the need for detailed exceptions in complete streets guidelines and complete streets policies, where it can be to make it clearer where additions are perhaps inappropriate, and that could strengthen the rationale for where they are appropriate. Next and finally, we have data. Planners did not seem to think there was a lack of data per se, but rather there was a lack of capacity to analyze and manage it. This was partly a human resources issue, but also a matter of creating better management systems. One practitioner noted how data management in their municipality was mostly analog, and meaning there could be much better and more automatic ways of managing it. There were some collection issues acknowledged, especially for Vision Zero. COVID in particular posed issues as transportation patterns were dramatically changed and will likely affect evaluation of countermeasures for years to come. And a lack of demographic data collected through enforcement means it's difficult to assess the burden that enforcement techniques from Vision Zero initiatives place on equity deserving groups. Solutions proposed here included the additional staff to manage and analyze data and the collection of demographic data. So there are a few key takeaways from the interviews. There's the need to continue updating policies and guidelines. Clear direction and stronger rationales in policies can help planners speak to the opposition to complete streets and Vision Zero projects, so they can point to the policy and say, this is why, this is what the municipality has decided is important. The reluctance to remove car space from the street is a significant and cross-cutting issue underlying many of the barriers discussed. And the result of this reluctance is street planners sometimes playing at the margins rather than really questioning the hierarchy of road space allocation. Streetscaping elements are often undervalued, and they in particular need better rationale in policies and guidelines, and they need communication and better understanding of the benefits of those elements. There's also a need for better communication among staff and better training that would enable more efficient implementation. And finally, there's a need for new staff or new roles to better analyze and manage data. So wrapping this up, we see that policy growth has led to an acceleration in implementation of complete streets and Vision Zero infrastructure, but there's room for policy improvements with better direction, more clarity, and more flexibility. The cultural component is very important, and to move towards better outcomes, it seems that planners need to think more about how to move beyond policy to address that issue. And finally, better communication about complete streets and Vision Zero projects would improve transparency. So if I may, I'm just going to briefly talk about my next steps, my next research, which is my major research project for my school. I'll be launching off of this work and focusing on that road diet piece or the car space subtraction piece discussed in the research. I was particularly interested in the different stances between complete streets and Vision Zero planners regarding the subtraction of car space from the road, which led me to my question of what is the role of road diets in complete streets and Vision Zero policy, and what role do road diets play in the practice of complete streets and Vision Zero planners. If you are a complete streets or Vision Zero planner or engineer, I would like to talk to you because I will need to be doing more interviews for this research. So if you're interested, please contact me at alex.haynes@torontomu.ca. That is it. Thank you very much for listening, and I will gladly open the floor to questions.
Thank you so much, Alex, for this presentation. Yes, we will be sharing the recording and the slides and the contact of Alex as well. Either directly reach to him, or if you forgot at some point later today or next days, reach out to us and we'll make that connection as well. Yeah, I'm going to jump right to the questions, if that's okay. The first one is really suggestions for more extensive consultation. Did any of your interviews talk about rapid implementation, project to quickly pilot, demonstrate complete street infrastructure without having to go through a years-long consultation and without anything to see first?
To my recollection, that was not a topic of conversation, but that's a really interesting idea that I'd love to explore further.
Yeah, I'm also interested in this because usually when we talk about streetscaping, consultation is required with public consultation is required. So I wonder what's the method to go around it. And if it's for the good, I assume that it's for good, for like complete streets project and stuff. Yeah, that could be interesting to be rapid, but otherwise, I think the idea is like, when the streetscaping and the design of the streets are proposed, they're proposed for the community, so therefore you need to hear their insights. Anyway, very good point, Graham. Thanks for that question. Moving on to the next one. How did you identify older complete street projects that may have been identified as things like road diet?
I'm not sure I completely understand the question. Is the participant able to elaborate?
Paula, if you would like to ask in a different way or provide information. Also for everyone else, I'm going to go through a bunch of the questions here in the Q&A box, but if you want to ask verbally, just raise your hand and I'll unmute you. Otherwise, I think okay, here we go. Let's Paula may elaborate on that.
Hi, it's Jeff Keyworth speaking, by the way. I was asked by Paula to attend on her behalf. So just to be fully clear, my link was for Paula's name, but it's actually Jeff Keyworth speaking. And anyway, the question is, you mentioned during the presentation that the Vision Zero projects, there was some challenges in identifying, and when you were going through your policy scan and so on, there's municipalities that do Vision Zero-ish kind of things, but don't necessarily use Vision Zero language. And I suspect you may have also had other issues, like where I think in our municipality, for a while we had we refused to call things Vision Zero just because I think there was some discomfort with the name.
Okay.
But anyway, I guess the question I had was, like, there are some projects locally that I can think of that they were never sold or justified as being quote unquote complete streets. However, they were more or less a complete street type of project but they were called like a road diet or something like that. So I'm just thinking, you mentioned that for Vision Zero, but you didn't elaborate on the complete streets. So I wondered if you had any challenges with identifying projects as potential complete streets implementations.
It was a big challenge to that policy scan, or to that project scan rather, particularly because I mentioned that not a lot of projects were explicitly calling themselves complete street projects, but just because they're not saying that explicitly doesn't mean that they're not complete streets projects, arguably. So I tried to more or less just use a method of generosity or charity. Like if I felt that arguably this was a complete streets project, I would code it as a complete streets project. So I tried to err on the side of assuming that it is versus not. So if it was something like a road diet or removing car space, I would code it as such. I think looking back through my coding, I think I'm in places might have been a little too generous with like multi-use trails. Sometimes I don't know if when I think critically about that, I'm not sure I would really categorize most multi-use trails as a complete street per se, because I think of complete streets as really being more about urban life. But I did code those as so I was taking a very broad approach. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate it, and it is challenging for sure. So thanks for elaborating a bit on your methodology. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you.
And if I'm not mistaken, this is from City of Kitchener, right?
Region of Waterloo, actually, although certainly we're located in Kitchener. Yeah.
Right. Can I ask you to elaborate a little bit on the next question, because there is a lot of
acronyms.
Yeah, acronyms that I'm not aware of.
So I was specifically referencing the Ontario Traffic Council, who recently released multimodal level of service guidelines for evaluating projects. So they're fairly recent, so they may have not been incorporated in very many projects. We were able to try incorporating them in a recent project, which has not yet been constructed. So from that perspective, I'm just curious if any survey participants talked about these guidelines as helping with implementations for complete streets or Vision Zero.
So I don't recall that being a topic of conversation. These interviews happened over in the summer, so I'm actually not familiar with these new guidelines from the province on multimodal level of service. But if it's very, very recent, then it may just not have been out yet.
They're not. I think they had been released by the summer, but certainly practitioners may not have been working with them much yet. This is actually the Ontario Traffic Council, so it's not the province. It's more of an industry group. But anyway, thank you for detailing that.
Of course, thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning in and the questions. And I was not aware of these guidelines, and I'll share a link shortly as well. Since we are taking Amber, here we go.
So am I unmuted?
You are.
Okay, good. So I have a question about your point around the barriers to implementation. Actually, I should introduce myself. I'm Amber Woldridge. I'm a public health nurse with Region of Waterloo. And hi to you, Jeff. I'm curious to understand more about the streetscaping elements being undervalued, and if you had any insights into like what type of information would be helpful or seen as useful to implement those streetscapes things? Because from a public health perspective, I can like talk about all the health benefits, but sometimes it seems like even though it's the thing that's better to do for people and for their health, because it costs more, it's not very, I don't know, it's just not done. It's pushed aside. So I don't know if you have any insights about that at all.
I might have some. What I seem to recall is that planners spoke about, it seemed like, and this was my impression from my scan as well, that complete streets can sometimes be reduced a little bit to just being about like hard infrastructure of like sidewalks and bike lanes. And forgetting that accommodating those users can is also about making it comfortable and delightful to use that space, not just a bare minimum of being able to use it. So I think that's one element, but my perception was that it was kind of twofold. The undervaluing was coming from like perhaps I think one of the ideas discussed was like the economic benefits versus the cost of maintenance. And one planner mentioned how the cost of upkeeping those trees was not always clear up front, which was the importance of the itemized costing I referenced in the presentation. One planner in particular talked about a project that was that kind of include all the bells and whistles of a complete streets project, but now they're taking out the street trees because they didn't realize, the municipality did not realize how much it would cost to maintain them. And then I guess there's also the aspect of not totally appreciating the value that they are giving, that maybe there is the return on investment is there, but it's not well understood, at least by the decision makers. Does that help?
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Amber.
Thank you.
We're gonna move to next questions. What are some best practices for eliminating car space? What if there are no alternative capacity on parallel roads to accommodate the traffic?
So I might be this might be going a bit outside my wheelhouse, but you know, I've done some research outside of this on obviously the concept of induced demand, but the inverse concept that is less researched but has a few key pieces of research called traffic evaporation. And maybe I'm getting a little speculative here. I think I'm speaking a little bit outside of my wheelhouse. So talking about what's going to happen if there aren't parallel roads to accommodate the traffic, I think there's room to talk about, are we just assuming that the traffic is going to stay the same level of demand? Because there's a chance that it won't, based on the research. But I should, you know, the big caveat here is that research is not, there's not a lot of that research, but there's a little bit. I hope that helps, but I'm speaking a little bit outside of my comfort zone there.
No, that's okay. Thanks so much for elaborating even like outside of this research on what you already kind of like know. Okay, a lot of questions. Next one. Could you please speak to the selection of individuals that participated in the interview, their roles, their relationship to Complete Street and Vision Zero projects? Yes, and how are they selected?
So I wasn't really part of the selection process. And actually, Desi, you might be able to speak to this more. So actually, maybe I'll just let you.
Thanks. Yeah, well, as I was reading it, I was like, I think that's on us. So as you may all know, so TCAD is the Center for Active Transportation. It's a program under Clean Air Partnership. The other bigger program under Clean Air Partnership is the Clean Air Council, which is a network of 40 plus municipalities, and the two programs are under the umbrella of Clean Air Partnership, and it was part of our. I think I'm going to be answering a little bit of a next question as well, but there was a TCAD developed this like complete street database back in 2019, and we are always curious to know like what's happening, is it used, and also we wanted to know like are this guidelines that were initially put, or like the language that is put in official plans, does it move forward? So we were more curious to see where the implementation is happening. So it was us that kind of like reach out to our CAC network to see who is available, who has already kind of like started, because some of the municipalities are in a very early stage. So we wanted to more to focus on the ones that have already in place policies, and to see from their experience what is happening. And the idea was that to inform everyone, but also to support the ones that are starting now their work so that they can learn from those lessons. I hope this answered the question. Okay, next question. Let's see. To address the communication issue, why not flip this on its head and require street designers to justify design exceptions for non-complete street implementation as needed? If I'm understanding this right, I think it's like speaking to, which I also had a kind of like a thoughts on like my own question is like, yeah, and you mentioned it that complete street as of now, the understanding is kind of like, oh, it's nice to have because it's like maybe it makes the street more beautiful, but actually it is a need to have. And how do we switch this understanding and like make it broader? And I think what here Jeff suggests is actually, can you make the planners to like say what is a complete street, so that probably like, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. I think Jeff wants to.
Just to elaborate slightly, I mean, you mentioned during the communication issues section that there are sometimes, staff don't communicate at the right time when, so that the complete street interventions could be added to projects. So I'm just suggesting that, and maybe there's no real answer to the question necessarily, but I mean, just thinking about it as yeah, like if all streets were by default complete streets, then the designers would be required to justify design exceptions on non-complete street implementations, and therefore the communication issue would be eliminated, because they would certainly go through that process if they feel they have to, as opposed to requiring somebody who may or may not care about the complete street implementation to mention during a meeting at the appropriate time, that there's oh, by the way, there may or may not be an opportunity here. So just like flip it around and maybe just require the design exception. But that would tend to lead to potentially a lot of road diets that may be unexpected, sort of
Right.
out of the gate.
I think that's a really good idea. I don't have anything to add to that. But that's a really great idea. Yeah.
Thanks, Jeff, for
Thank
that.
you.
Yeah, it is interesting. Next thing. You reviewed barriers to implementation. Did you review what is working? What are cities who have implemented many complete streets projects doing it differently?
Yeah, that was a comment actually I received early on in the process. I think TCAT kind of, when I came in, already had defined like what they wanted from it. So I didn't look at that much, but I think that would be another good step for how to take this research forward.
Yeah, and I think TCAT and CAP are interested in actually kind of like having, I think we had some report on that, or TCAT had some report on that back in like the early days, maybe update of that will be interesting as well, so we can see some good examples and have a kind of like a mind of like where we want to go. Last questions here. Municipalities are preparing provincially mandated asset management plans, capturing all life cycle costs, risks, and etc. Are you seeing that this is as a help or a hindrance to complete street acceptance? Jeff, do you want to speak up on this? I kind of like, I don't know. Alex, are you okay with this? I'm not.
Yeah, I feel like it may just be outside my realm of expertise to totally answer, but if you want to elaborate, yeah, please do.
Jeff, I did unmute you. Oh,
sorry, I'm not sure it was my question. I thought you answered all the questions I posed, but
well, this is Jeff Hagan.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
Okay.
He's not responding anyway. Do you have any insights on that? The other Jeff? Oh.
No, I can't see the question. Like it only shows up in the Q&A box after it's been answered.
Oh, here.
So it's current. Oh, there it is. Okay, municipalities are preparing provincially mandated asset management plans capturing all lives. Are you seeing that as help or hindrance to complete street acceptance? Yeah, that's tricky. I mean, we've had a few conversations internally with our along the lines of some of the things you mentioned in your presentation, like for sort of hypothetically, if we were to do a complete street conversion, then what would be the linear cost per kilometer, of such a street conversion? And that tends to what tends to happen on those ones is because in many cases you're moving curbs and then you're redesigning storm sewers and that kind of thing. So the costs tend to be quite high. So how to kind of go beyond that and say, that we're gonna do this is a tricky one. Like our program development group is really struggling in terms of their capital program, and I suspect other municipalities are in the same boat, so that they ideally they're rehabilitating a road instead of reconstructing it. But then when you do the rehabilitation, the opportunities to move curbs around to do complete street implementations are reduced. So it's a very kind of a complicated question. And so I think some of your other recommendations with respect to like, increasing budgets, for example, that's kind of an obvious one, but it would be helpful. So I don't really have a great answer, I'm afraid, but hopefully, some of that word salad was helpful.
Thanks
so
much.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
I kind of like, I also was wondering, one of the kind of like what you mentioned in the presentation is the difficulties in collaboration and communication between departments as well, which we experienced overall. We work on that kind of like a lot with the climate staff and sustainability staff that are trying to implement the action plans. And I was wondering if you have any, or if you heard, or if you have any thoughts on like how to enhance the collaboration in order to support the implementation of complete streets.
All I can really speak to is, I think, what was spoken to in interviews. I didn't mention it explicitly. I hope I'm remembering the name of it, but I understand that the City of Toronto recently, or somewhat recently, introduced, I believe it's called like an interdivisional oversight committee or something that flags. One of the interviews mentioned this, that overviews transportation projects. So yeah, there could be either a specific staff member or a committee that's responsible for making sure that communication does happen. But there was also, I mean, part of that communication piece is obviously going to be related to the culture piece. Not all of it, because as I mentioned, planners and engineers are busy, but sometimes it may not necessarily be a disagreement with the notions of complete streets and Vision Zero, but a lack of care, like not seeing it as particularly important. It's kind of like that streetscaping element, like it's a nice to have, not a need to have. So training could be involved. I mean, one idea that I thought was kind of fun that was talked about in interviews, and it's not necessarily an idea per se, like a hard technique that could be implemented, but there's also the role of life experience that can change how people perceive things like cycling as an important element of our urban landscape. And if like there is the opportunity to think about how municipalities can encourage its staff to have varying life experiences.
Yeah, I'm a bit laughing here, but I think we had this conversation with you that we would like to see whenever you have a test drive, like to get a car like driving license to also be included biking.
Yeah.
So that you get this experience and the knowledge of like how it's moving. But yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Good point. Okay, I was just going to say there are no more questions, but one just came in. Another question, just a comment. Hope that this is the research so far is helping to develop appreciation that there isn't an ideal way to implement projects. Things get messy, like most things that are aspirational in spirit, embrace reality. Thanks, Hank. Yeah, that is yeah, I like this because actually during COVID we saw a little bit more like implementation on not specifically complete streets, but like because there is the need of being outside and commuting in with your own, so there is a little bit more like biking happening. So I guess and it wasn't like it didn't take much consultation or anything. It was just like action. So I hope we don't need another COVID or anything like bad like this, but actually being able to see projects. And yeah, you're right. Sometimes it's not. Most of the time, it's not ideal. This is from us. There are a few minutes left, but I'm sure that people will be grateful to have some minutes back to themselves. Thank you very much, Alex, for sharing this insights and this research. And hopefully the next step of this research will be also moving forward, and I'll be happy to hear more about it. Thanks everyone who joined us today and for your insights and questions and comments and participation. It was great. Stay tuned for more of our upcoming events in the next year. And meanwhile, enjoy the holiday season. Hopefully it's going to be a white Christmas at some point. That's for me. Enjoy the rest of the day. Bye.